or a believer is not given the option, because of his or her belief, of not recognizing the worth of the non-believer. In other words, emanating out of that belief of the individual, the worth of the individual, that person who is religiously grounded in America has, as a part of that grounding, an obligation to recognize the worth of that individual who does not believe, and to extend them the same rights and to extend them the same liberties. So there was a wonderful thinker, originally a Lutheran minister, later a Catholic priest, Father Newhouse, Richard John Newhouse. He died a few years ago. I had the privilege of knowing him somewhat. He was an intimate of Martin Luther King Jr. He was Martin Luther King Jr.'s outreach person to the various Christian faiths, except for organizations, except for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, because Martin Luther King was already a member of that. And I had a chance to talk with him a couple years before he passed away, and he told me that one of the things that he observed was that the writers of the time, the news writers of the time, and the historians now continually undercut the religious basis of Martin Luther King's message on civil rights. And he told me that it was central to Martin Luther King Jr.'s call for the cause of civil rights. And so, even at the time he was doing it, there were those who were quote-unquote contemporary historians who were not recognizing the essence of his message. And I happen to think that if you see that interplay of religious belief throughout the history of this country, particularly at important times in this country, times of peril, times of challenge, that you have to ask yourself, if it was important at the founding of this republic, if it was important at the time of the Revolution, if it was important at the time of the Constitutional Convention, if it was important at the time of the Civil War, if it were important at the time of World War II, if it were important at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, why is it not important now? Either are those historical moments of progress in our nation would have happened without that, or they were appropriate to those times but are not appropriate to these times. And I think it is the height of arrogance to suggest that it was important to those times, but we, men and women, have progressed so much that we separate ourselves from any notion of religion. I happen to believe it's illogical, it's unreasonable, it's or anti-historic. Okie dokie. Yes, sir. The radio man.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to pull the microphone a little closer to you. You quoted the statement, "Men are no angels," and that, of course, accepts man's sinful nature, his imperfect nature. It seems to support the notion of government regulation rather than deregulation. Where would you stand on that issue?
Well, you got to understand the rest of that quote. The quote was, "If men were angels, we would need no government." But it goes on to say that since men are not angels, we need government. But then it goes on to say the first thing you have to do is learn to control the government. In other words, govern the governed. Tocqueville's argument was that, or one of his observations was that because we had religion in the United States, it enhanced the worth of the individual vis-a-vis the state. In other words, to the extent that the freedom that was expressed and recognized through religious belief, it set a counterweight to the government. Some people have said it this way. They've said the larger the government becomes, the smaller the individual becomes. In Catholic social teaching, there's something known, one of the principles is the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity is essentially that an individual is responsible for his or her own actions and ought to do everything that he or she can to carry out your functions as a human being, including taking care of yourself. And if you need assistance, you move first to the next level, which is the family. If you need assistance out that, you move to the next level of society, which is closest to you, because you don't want government, a distant government, overwhelming you as the individual. So I would say in the area of regulation, you need smart, responsible regulation which is necessary to the purpose of government, but nothing beyond that. So that I'm not against regulation, I'm against dumb regulation, I'm against over-regulation, I'm against oppressive regulation, and I am particularly against regulation which comes from afar. That is, if you have government that is closest to you making decisions that affect you personally, you have a greater opportunity to affect those who are making those decisions. I mean, I have to be in Washington, D.C. much of the time because we're in session voting there. Despite the fact I come home and have town hall meetings, I have teletown hall meetings, I try and keep in contact with people by email, it is usually easier for the average person to go down and visit their city council person than it is to go to Washington, D.C. or wait for those times when we break and I can come back. That's just a small example of why the government works that way. So I don't think it's a question of regulation versus no regulation. It's smart regulation, reasonable regulation, and it is a understanding of government that it has limits. You see, society and state are two different things. The state is part of society, but society is far more than the state. Society is the individual, society's the churches, society's the families, society's the Cub Scouts, societies. The state is important, but it is not an all-encompassing definition of society. And I think that if the state assumes a role that is beyond its legitimate role and establishes regulations there, they are encumbering or taking away your freedom or my freedom beyond what is necessary. And I can just ask a simple question. How many out there pay your income tax voluntarily? Why do you do it? Because it's the law, right?
It's required.
It's the law. Now, most of us want to follow the law. But we don't voluntarily pay our taxes in the sense that, God, I get up in the morning and, you know, I earn $100 a day. I want to give 30 or 40 or 50 of those dollars away. No. But we do understand that there's a legitimate purpose in government, and we are willing to accept the mandatory obligation that government imposes on us to pay taxes because we think that's legitimate. But make no mistake, it is mandatory. And so I think you have to keep that in mind all the time. Obviously, I'm not against government, but I am against government being the end-all and be-all because it's not. You know, it's just not.
I've got one more.
Yes, sir.
Has to do with campaign finance. Because of the fact that, you know, government shouldn't be in our community. You know, 12 years ago, Elk Grove became a city. We have a lot of city pride. We have a lot of identity as ourselves, not as, you know, a bedroom community of Sacramento or some subset of somebody else. But we're Elk Grove. We're a city that has an identity of our own. And in your election and other elections that are occurring all at this time, the freedom of speech that's been given to people to fund campaigns through all these various
Right.
funds, right? PACs, super PACs, and all this stuff. These are all outside dollars, outside voices coming into our community. Do you think that there's a place where that should be limited, where a community should be able to decide for itself what it wants to know, what it wants to think?
Well, you've heard of the movie The Inconvenient Truth, right? By Al Gore. There is a greater inconvenient truth. It's called the Constitution. And the First Amendment, freedom of speech clause, has been interpreted by the U.S. Supreme Court to say that you have a right to spend your money to express your opinion or to amplify your expression of your opinion. You can print something. You can buy radio ads. You can buy television ads. The Supreme Court decision called Citizens United, which is the one that many argue has allowed these outside groups, quote unquote, was actually a very fundamental opinion, because here's what the court decided. They said, first of all, the essence of the First Amendment free speech clause is the protection of political speech, which is kind of interesting because they've been talking about all sorts of things, nude dancing and all sorts of things instead of political speech. Finally got to say this is about political speech. They then said, does your right to free speech, that is your right to express your political opinion, does the government have a right to interfere with that right if you express it in concert with somebody else? In other words, if you and I get together expressing the same opinion, which probably makes the volume of our speech louder, does the fact that we are doing it together give the government a right to interfere with our right to speech? And they said, no, that's illogical. So then the third thing they said was, if in fact we cannot interfere with your free speech right because you do it in concert with someone else, can we make a distinction in terms of the type of association you have? In other words, you're a family, or you're a church group, or you're a political group? They said no. Then they said, well, if that's the case, can we make that distinction between someone who associates, a group of people associate by way of a corporation as opposed to a non-corporation? And they said there's no legitimate reason for that. And they said, you don't want the government in a position of deciding, you're a good group, so you get your First Amendment rights. We don't like what you have to say, so we're not going to have your First Amendment. That's what they said. And so we are in a dilemma. What do we do? My solution to it would be to change the campaign finance laws and take the limits off so that individual contributors would give to candidates rather than these outside groups. But I would require the reporting to be instantaneous. That is, as soon as you get it, you got to report it by way of the internet. And I would put a limit. I don't know if it's 20,000 or 50,000. Someone gives up to that amount of money, they would have to complete that contribution 1 week before the election, so there would be sufficient time for people to see what it is. See, I would rather have that money go to the candidates and the parties and have them responsible for the message rather than outside groups. I don't know what outside groups are going to say who are for me or against me. I think it would be better if I were responsible for the message and my opponent were responsible for his message and his party. Right now we have restrictions of how much the party can work with me and my opponent's party work with him. We can't talk about certain things at different times. This is silly. People know I'm a Republican. They know he's a Democrat. It's no surprise. We ought to drive the money towards the parties and the candidates rather than these outside groups. And as long as you have the First Amendment in the Constitution, and I do not want to amend the Constitution, I think it works pretty well. As long as you have it that way, you're going to have to deal with the fact that we're not going to limit the ability of people to express their political positions. I would have the incentive for contributors to give to candidates and parties rather than outside groups. Not a perfect solution, but I think then what happens is a candidate says, why did you say that about me? Well, I didn't say it. This group said it. Well, why don't you tell them not to say it? Well, I really can't communicate with them because I would break the law. You would change that to say, well, why don't you tell those contributors to give to you instead of this outside group so that you're responsible for the content of the commercial rather than them? I think it does change it somewhat. All right? Okay, thank you very, very much. This hardy group.